everybody doing? Good? Good. All right. My name is Luke Saranac, and I would like to welcome you to today's Student Government Association and Women's Activity Committee sponsored Lyceum. Our speaker today is Mr. Lowell Handler. Mr. Lowell is the former Black Star contract photographer journalist whose pictures have appeared in Life, Newsweek, Elle, U.S. News and World Report, the London Sunday Times, the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Southern Poverty Law Center's Intelligence Report, and Teaching Tolerance, as well as many international journals from Brazil to Japan. Mr. Handler's appearances on Dateline NBC, The Phil Donahue Show, and national television programs in Canada and the Netherlands have helped increase awareness and understanding of Tourette syndrome. He has proved an affable spokesperson for a disorder characterized by behavior that appears off-putting. As the star, narrator, guide, and associate producer of the Emmy-nominated PBS television documentary, Twitch and Shout, Handler reached a mainstream audience and set the stage for his 1998 memoir, Twitch and Shout, A Tourette's Tale, published by Penguin. Twitch and Shout, A Tourette's Tale was profiled in the New York Times Book Review and called by Entertainment Weekly a mind-bending account of a mind-boggling affliction. The author's other written work has been published in the New York Observer, Health, and the American Psychological Association's Contemporary Psychology. Lowell was the technical consultant and set photographer on the film Niagara, starring Robin Tooney and Henry Thomas. The still photographer and advisor on the Tick Code, starring Gregory Hines. The partial inspiration for Rob Murrow's directorial debut, Maze, and Jonathan Letham's Touretting detective in Letham's novel, Motherless Brooklyn. So it is with great pleasure that I present to you Mr. Lowell Handler.
Hi, everybody. So today, as you probably are aware, I'm presenting a new book, which is my second book. It's an e-book. It's entirely electronic. It exists only in electronic format. And you can buy it on Amazon, or if you have an iPad, you can buy it on where you buy books for the iPad, which I believe is the iTunes store, isn't that right? The iTunes store, you can buy it for the iPad. It's primarily made for the iPad, but you can also view it on the Kindle or the Nook or any Android e-reader. The advantage, of course, to the iPad is that you have all the media in one place, which you don't have in any other e-reader at all. So in other words, you can see the video, the photographs, the text, all in one format with the iPad. You're not able to do that in any other e-reader that's currently made, whether it's an Android, a Kindle, a Nook, or whatever. But you can also get it as a plain PDF file for any computer. And you can buy it at www.crazyandproud.com or on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. So the book basically chronicles a year of time between 1999 and 2000, the year just before I came to Dutchess as a full-time teacher, when I was living in New York City and teaching and working as a recreation person at a shelter for homeless, mentally ill women. And my idea at the time was to use photography and to get a camera, which was donated by the camera's manufacturer to the shelter, and to start photography classes with the mentally ill homeless women in the shelter, and to show them how to photograph and have them discover photography and explore some of their own experiences, some of our experiences together, and some of the experiences of people living in the neighborhood where the shelter was, through photography, through black and white, traditional film photography. We had the pictures developed and processed by a lab. Luckily, the shelter had a budget for this, and we were able to look at the pictures every week after they were processed, and we were able to pick out pictures and go over them together. And the first thing I'm going to show you today is the video from the book, which runs about 6 minutes. Then I'm going to read a selection to you from the book, a selection which introduces the photographs, and the photographs are done, as I mentioned, you can see them all with the media contained here. You can see them, the 62 photographs in a slideshow with original jazz music. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the experience that I had. And I'm going to take some questions and answers from the audience, okay? So here is the book. It's called Crazy and Proud. And I think the video, which we'll put up here full screen, will explain part of how I got to this point, how I got to the shelter in 1999, and what my experience was and what our collective experience was. Full screen. There we go. You can read that. Can you shut off this light, maybe? It's a short video.
When I was working at the shelter, I realized right away that the women who lived there were better photographers than my students that I had in colleges. The reason for that is because the students who are 18 or 19 years old know a little bit about photography, but they know nothing about life. And the women knew nothing about photography, but they knew everything about life. So they were able to take photographs that were full of meaning, even though technically they didn't know about photography. I first got to the shelter because of an ad in the New York Times that advertised for a media and recreation specialist. I couldn't find a job. I couldn't find any job at all. Even the most menial, lowest paying job I couldn't get. A lot of this was because of my Tourette syndrome, and I put off interviewers even though I explained what it was, but I couldn't find a job, and after a year of searching, I answered this ad in the Times, and a few days later I got a call to come for an interview in a hellish, forsaken part of New York City. It took me an hour and 3 subway transfers to get there from my apartment. I interviewed with 2 women who ran the shelter, both of whom had sons with Tourette syndrome and obsessive compulsive disorder, and knew me from the film Twitch and Shout, which was on PBS just 3 years earlier.
I was taking photography classes at a shelter. We seemed to have fun walking around the block and taking pictures of people. Citizens in the town. When I met Lowell, he was like a friend to me. The class was an opportunity for not only me but other individuals, you know, in the situation that I was in, to go out and experience something like photography. The environment at the shelter sometimes is very difficult. In one cubicle, there was about 30 people. There's a lot of anger within some of the residents. There's a lot of ignorance. It's very hard for individuals sometimes who are trying to branch out for themselves and make some kind of a living, or to get to even socialize with different people. People sometimes were taking other people's belongings. People were fighting like cats and dogs. I suppose things would go very much different if people just knew how to treat each other.
You got into some fights there, right?
Well, I did have a brawl every now and then, but well, it was, matter of fact, I might have had about two. I had about two brawls, and it wasn't nothing serious. I was much younger, but it was just, I was attacked actually. I was actually attacked twice, and I had to defend myself. I had no choice but to retaliate. For people that don't have any place other than a shelter to subside, it's just the best thing to do is to basically branch out and take care of all that you need to take care of. Don't just sit there and let your life just pass you by.
That's the website for the book. There's a sample of the book at the website, a sample chapter and some sample photographs, and you can buy it there as well. Now, the woman featured that you see there in the video, it's very interesting because the way that I reconnected with D'Angela, who's the woman featured in the video, was just a couple of years ago. And it had been at least 10 years since our collective experience at the shelter. And I presented this work, the genesis of what became this book, to the Mental Health Association and NAMI, the local chapter, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, which is the largest nonprofit in the country for people with mental illness and their families. And the local Hudson Valley chapter asked me to present this a couple of years ago in Poughkeepsie. And in the room were about 100 people in a small room. And I noticed that there was a woman in the room that looked familiar. And I thought, could that be her? Could that be the woman from the shelter? And I started to present, and I was holding up the photographs, and I held up that big photograph of D'Angela, and I said, do you see? And she looked up and she said, yes, it's me. And so I realized that it was her. And she's now living in Beacon, in Dutchess County, on her own independently. And since that day, a couple of years ago, we've become friends. And so we've kept in touch. That day when we reunited, we exchanged contact information. And we've been in touch ever since, and we get together and we hang out. And I've lent her a camera a number of times to take some more pictures. And you'll see some of her more recent pictures are included here in the collection in the book. And D'Angela is living independently in Beacon, and she has schizophrenia, so she still has some problems, but she's getting along okay. She's living in a studio apartment by herself. And I was so surprised to see her that day, a couple of years ago, with the NAMI chapter. And it's just incredible that she ended up here. And I couldn't believe that it was really her. But in order to introduce the photographs, you can see here on the table of contents that there are a total of, trying to turn the page here. Can't quite turn the page. Okay. There are a total of 7 chapters in total. And I'm going to read from chapter 4 right now. On taking and making photographs. You can see now I can turn the page, okay? So I'm going to read a selection from chapter 4. Even though I had been on the faculty at the renowned university, the New School in New York, for many years, teaching mentally ill homeless women to to use a camera and think about photography critically was bound to be challenging. I had successfully procured a 35mm single reflex camera, not digital, but a traditional film camera from the manufacturer Pentax for our program. I justified my request by outlining our budgetary constraints, our nonprofit status, and the population we served. When the camera arrived, I decided it was probably better for me to set the lens openings and shutter speeds for the women so they could just focus on what they saw in front of the camera and shoot. Many had learning disabilities and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and their ability to concentrate was limited. It would be simpler to have the technique stripped away, allowing them to focus primarily on subject matter. This at least seemed feasible. When I made the rounds inside the shelter, only a few of the women responded to my invitation to venture out into the streets. Beth, Jackie, Denise, and Trish would form the core of my little band of amateur photographers. On our first outing, I encouraged them to observe and photograph whatever struck them as interesting in this forsaken neighborhood, which showed so much life in spite of neglect, viewing the scene through the prism of their collective experience. The act of photographing forced the women to interact with community members in a positive way, pushing them to really view things in a squint, to actively see instead of looking passively or habitually. We worked as a team, passing the camera between us like a hand weight. Treating the equipment a bit irreverently helped the women be less intimidated by the act of photographing. As we took pictures, I explained that there were two kinds of photographic portraits, one in which the subject is unaware of the photographer, a candid. I've often thought about the performance nature of photography. However, I believe the best photographs are almost always those where the subject or subjects are caught unaware. The other is a type of collaboration between the subject and the photographer, where the viewer accepts the premise of a visual exchange between someone's willingness to be seen, between someone's interest in seeing and someone else's willingness to be seen that results in a photograph. If the women wanted to photograph someone up close, I had to help them understand why they needed first to approach the person and ask if they minded being photographed. I also explained that if there were a group of people unaware of or uninterested in our presence, they could take the picture more freely. It can take a lot of time before a subject can become comfortable enough to at least temporarily forget about the camera. When I photograph, I try to be invisible as possible, though a constant stream of Tourette's tics can sometimes be difficult to ignore. It was interesting to see how the different individuals approached photography, each in their own unique way. Beth, a tall woman who imagined herself as Diana Ross at times, liked to take self-portraits and made one stunning picture of herself by holding the camera at arm's length and pointing it toward her. It made a dramatic picture with the barbed wire fencing in the background. Jackie, a 20-something woman from the streets, was by far the most outgoing, bodacious even, getting right up close to her subjects. Denise, now in her mid-40s, had lived in shelters most of her life and was often in her own world, quiet and contemplative, not speaking much to the others. I tried to draw her out, often to no avail, but she seemed to find interest in the picture making, producing haunting images like the one of someone viewed walking through the metal fencing of the shelter. The more outgoing Trish photographed some of the others in the group, like Jackie doing a cartwheel, and even some of me. I had reviewed these women's histories briefly in the loose-leaf binders in the shelter's office. I was given access to these records and was encouraged to read them and referred back to them from time to time. As with many of the other shelter residents, the stories of their lives read more like plots of some tragic novel, but in this case, it was all real. It took quite a while for the women to accept the presence of a middle-class white man with a camera in their midst. Many were wary of someone from the staff capturing them on film when they were actively using drugs and turning tricks. Some were worried that I would turn them in, meaning possible jail time instead of a bed at the shelter. I wanted them to take photographs of their world, but it would be some time before I would be able to get close enough to take the photographs I wanted of them. The women and I went out several times a week, and while the makeup of the group changed somewhat, Beth, Jackie, Denise, and Trish were regulars. The photographs they took, the best of which are reproduced in this volume, are very good and better than most of the work produced by many of my college students. No offense to anybody here. I had to think about this. The women in the shelter knew nothing about photography, yet they knew a great deal about life. The photographs were direct, straightforward, and compelling. The pictures captured their environments, the women themselves, and their relationship to each other and their surroundings. We were using photography as a kind of art therapy in the real world, or perhaps a form of visual anthropology. The sessions were therapeutic, but also instructive and at times an exercise in group dynamics. Sometimes people didn't want to be photographed, especially those selling drugs or themselves. Other times they were simply suspicious of our intentions. When we told them we were taking photographs for a class, they almost always acquiesced in the process. But then I thought, why does someone need a reason to photograph? When asked what I was doing, when I was out photographing by myself, I would simply say, I'm a photographer and that's what I do. One Saturday morning, the weather was nice and we walked for a long time in the shadow of the elevated train until we ended up in front of a large apartment building surrounded by a circular brick wall where an older man was sitting observing us. What are you all taking pictures of, he asked. Whatever we see, Trish replied. People playing dominoes, Jackie said. I told the guy we were from the shelter and that I was teaching the women about photography. Why don't you take my picture, he asked. He was a white guy with deep creases in his face and appeared as if he had really done some living. He said his name was Wilbur and that he'd been the janitor in this building for some 20 years. The women looked at me as if to say, is it okay to photograph him? And I nodded it. He said, go ahead. With that, Jackie began snapping away. Wilbur was old but still proud-looking and powerfully built with the lines of experience in his face exposed in the bright afternoon sun. I used to do photography, Wilbur said. Back in the day, I liked photographing women. And now we're photographing you, Trish said with a laugh. And she put the camera to her eye and snapped. Did you ever play in a rock band, Beth asked. No, Wilbur said, but I've listened to rock music my whole life. Did you ever hear of the Supremes, Beth pressed? Of course, Wilbur continued. You look a little like Diana Ross. Beth was so thrilled, she gave Wilbur a hug, and he didn't mind. I asked Wilbur about the tenants in the building, and he said most had been living there for a very long time. I told him I'd lived in Queens as a boy, and we talked a bit about how the city had changed over the years. I was a young man when I came to work here, Wilbur said wistfully. Now I'm so old that sometimes I think I'm farting dust. I laughed and said, yeah, but what's the alternative? I hear you, he said, but growing old sucks. At least that's what my daddy used to say. After we'd left Wilbur behind, Trish expressed surprise that he'd wanted us to take his picture, and I explained that sometimes people want to be recognized for who they are or what they've done. Wilbur had been easy to talk to and had shown a face full of character to the camera. Through this process, both formal and intimate, the women repeatedly engaged with people they might otherwise never meet. There were also times when there would be competition between the women. Who would take the most pictures? Who would get the best shot? Who would be the most daring? Once Trish played at being a newscaster, tilting a pretend microphone toward me. Okay, now what do you think, Mr. Councilman? She asked, to which I responded, I think they should all go to jail. Trish walked very fast to keep up with me while I acted as if I didn't want to be interviewed. The others soon got into the act, with one woman posing as a criminal, hiding her identity from the camera by covering her face with a hood. There was an aspect of voyeurism in Denise, I thought. She is not participating, but getting great pleasure in viewing the other women's activity. Trish and Jackie were feeding off one another's energy, trying to see who could one-up one with antics. Games like this sometimes arose during our outings, no matter that it had nothing to do with photography, or did it? While some photographs might speak of beauty or shape, color, line, form, texture, light, symmetry, or other aspects of visual language, in our group we were more concerned with subject matter and the photographer's approach to that subject matter. Isn't photography also about voyeurism, exploitation, looking and investigating? At least it is in part. Even as early as 1890, in his classic work, How the Other Half Lives, with illustrations chiefly from photographs by the author, the activist journalist Jacob Riis turned his lens on the poor in some of New York City's worst tenements in a milestone of photographic social realism. This style of photography was quite popular in the 1940s and 50s, practiced by such notable photographers as Lisette Modell, who was my friend and mentor, and Bernice Abbott, who was Lisette's friend and mentor, as well as Ouija, Louis Farr, Eugene Smith, and numerous others. In the 1960s and early 70s, Diane Arbus, a student and protege of Lisette, took this a step further, trying to capture on film the psychological aspects of people on the fringes of society. In their intimate focus on their subjects, were the women in my group exploiting an expected sense of trust or privacy by taking pictures of their very raw subjects and one another? Was I exploiting them? And was exploitation actually a good thing if it led to some kind of insight or empathy? In her 1977 book, On Photography, Susan Sontag asks these questions of all of us who take pictures, make pictures, those who are the subject of pictures, and all those who view them, that is, the audience. Although in my own photographs I am constantly wrestling with the question of influence, how my work relates to what has come before, I had decided not to show the women in my group books or films regarding the history of photography. I was quite wary of encouraging them to simply imitate what they had seen and wanted them to create pictures in a way that was spontaneous and natural. In fact, the women's photographs looked very much as if the person taking them were seeing and photographing for the first time. It was joyful viewing them. Nothing was cliched. Things and people looked fresh and alive rather than tired or pat. Stigma and illness don't figure in these pictures. Where is the table of contents? There it is. Okay. So now I'm going to show you the selection of photographs, okay, from the book. Here they are. I ended up working at the shelter for a little over a year. I ended up working there, and it was a very interesting experience. It was very difficult. It was very hard in some ways. It was a difficult job, and in 2000, I got the job here, and I've been here ever since, full-time, since 2000. I had started here as an adjunct in 1990, and had worked here part-time as teaching a couple of courses as an adjunct until 1994, when I moved to the city to do all this work in social work. I learned quite a bit about human nature from the work, I think. And I also learned things about myself and about other people, and I found a lot of the stories in the book, the other chapters of the book, other than what I read this afternoon, involve the women themselves and their own stories, and a lot of them were taken from audio recordings, old cassette audio recordings that I did with the women in the shelter while I worked there. And so I had this collection of recordings that I used to transcribe from, and then I wrote the chapters in the book based on those recordings with commentary. And a lot of the chapters, a number of the chapters, involve whole stories of different people's lives and what they've been through and all of that. So do you guys have questions, or do you have comments, or yes?
Out of all the photographs, which one is your favorite?
Which one is my favorite photograph? Oh, I don't know if I have an exact favorite. I don't know if I have a favorite. I mean, I like the pictures that the women took, you know, because the other ones I took, and they're not my favorite. But the ones the women, I mean, some of them you could see, right, that some of them were by the women. You saw the picture of D'Angelo that I took just a couple of years ago, the square one. I went to her place in Beacon and did that. And then a couple of the others are more recent ones from her, because I kept lending her a camera, giving her film, so that she could shoot some more stuff. But yeah, I don't think I have a favorite. Yeah, Christine.
So it seems that working in the, it just seemed like it would be so emotionally and psychologically exhausting.
It was very stressful.
Did you feel that having your camera there helped to sustain you?
Yes, the way that I photographed there actually was quite interesting, because I didn't have a full-size camera. I used a camera that's called a Minox. It's this big, it literally fits right inside your shirt pocket, like the size of a pack of cigarettes. And it's a full-frame 35mm camera, but it's only this big. And it unfolds, and people don't even know that you're photographing, don't even know that you have the camera, even though it takes regular full-size 35mm film. It's called the Minox. And I use that camera to take all of these pictures. And it has a very sharp lens, but you have to estimate the focus by the feet or meters on the lens, so there's no visual focus that you can see. So it's difficult, but I got used to using it, and it did help. It's like something that I was able to do there a lot, and people weren't, I mean, I got permission to do the whole book from the agency that ran the shelter, so, but at the very beginning, they weren't really sure that I had a camera there, because it was so sort of secretive. Then I got permission eventually to do the whole thing, and they agreed, and I just did it. Yeah.
What was the most difficult part about the assignment, or about working there?
About the work there? The most difficult thing, I find some of that here, in my job here, I think, and I find it other places as well, I think that the truth of the matter is that whenever you get a group of people gathered together in one place, you attain all of the problems and idiosyncrasies and difficulties of all of those people, and problems start to arise, no matter what setting it's in. Whether even here in the classroom, there are all the personalities of the other people you work with, the personalities of the students, all the different personal problems come into play. But of course, in the shelter, it's much more extreme. It was much more extreme because the women were literally, as D'Angelo said, 30 of them living in one room, like a dorm, just on cots. And so all of that is magnified. There were fights, there was one day that I literally had to pull apart 300-pound women with 2x4s in their hands. So it gets much more, it's much more intense and much more difficult than here, but it's magnified.
So, was the photography some type of therapeutic exercise that kind of temporarily took their minds off of whatever illnesses they had?
I think you could say that. I would never say that photography is a treatment or is a cure for mental illness, but I would say that any type of activity which does, that you can escape in and find some positive reinforcement and satisfaction is at least a temporary alleviation of whatever problems you're having and sometimes help you deal with them. Yeah, Mary.
What was the process? You went out with them, you shared the camera, they were shooting, then did you have the film commercially developed?
I had the film developed in the lab because the shelter had a budget for that. So the film I would take every week to the lab, which luckily was in the neighborhood where I lived, which is the East Village in Manhattan. And I would walk the film to the lab and I would drop it off and then pick it up the next week or a few days later. Then we would go over the contact sheets. We would pick out pictures and mark the contact sheets with grease pencil and pick out prints to make. And then we would have the prints made by the lab again. And then we'd review them together in a group, go over them, talk about them.
So, and then for the whole process, were they working on the content of the pictures, or did they ever get into any of the technical stuff? Did you always set the leaders?
Yeah, I tended to, they got into a little bit of the technical stuff, but most of that, I would just set the camera because I didn't want to be bogged down with that. I felt it was better if we just concentrated on the picture. I didn't get involved like we do now with the classes. It wasn't a college course for credit like it is here, where you have to know the technical stuff, you have to know how to do this. It was just really recreational. Judy.
It seems like you obviously developed a very special relationship with these women, and I'm wondering if you feel as if your Tourette's maybe helped you establish a relationship that maybe somebody else might not have been able to establish.
Yeah, I think it did. I think it did. And it was interesting because there was only one other man working at the shelter besides me. Everybody else that worked there was a woman. And I think the Tourette did because they saw that I had a problem, that I had something that I had to do. But it could also turn the other way. It could also work against me certain times. I mean, there were people didn't understand, or if the women were very cautious about a man, or some of them had been abused, had been physically or sexually abused. So it could go both ways. But I feel like, in general, it was an advantage in this situation, not in other situations.
Well, when you first presented this, it was probably a couple of years ago, in the Writing Center, you were talking about the difficulties you were having publishing it as a book because of the prohibitive costs.
It was a prohibitive cost, yes.
So
how was it
can you tell us a
finally
little
done?
bit about the process?
Okay, what happened was I exhausted every possibility of a publisher that I possibly could. It was turned down by every publisher imaginable. I finally decided that I had to publish the book because it was that important to me. So what I did was I was able to raise the money to pay a computer expert to put together the book. It cost a total of $12,000. That $12,000 wasn't only to produce the book, it was also doing the Facebook stuff, the email blast, a lot of extra things. But the all-inclusive cost was about $12,000. I was able to raise the $12,000 from the website, crazyandproud.com, and also from a presentation on Kickstarter. Are you familiar with Kickstarter? I put it on Kickstarter, so through Kickstarter and the website, my own website, I was able to raise the $12,000. I didn't spend a cent of my own money, but the $12,000 went to the production of the book in the computer expert. I digitized and photoshopped all the images. I gave him everything ready to go. And I also had to pay a top editor in New York to edit the whole manuscript. That cost something also.
Yeah, how about the audio and the, any cost for the music that you use?
No, very little. We got I think it was like $100. We got use of the original music, this original jazz. I think that was like $100. That was part of the cost. And I got Devin Pickering, who is the filmmaker and who was a former student here in the comm program, to use the videotape. The scene with D'Angela was done in my house, and I lit it, and we filmed it, we did the audio, and then we shot some stuff at her place in Beacon. Yeah, we banged out the video in a couple of days. I think the video was quite good. And so that's how it was done. Now, of course, the other problem is that nobody knows that it's there, because it's there, and it's in cyberspace, and nobody really knows about it. So I've done certain things to try to bring attention to it. I did a couple of radio shows. I did a radio show in New York City. I did a radio show, public radio show by phone out in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I did some presentations of this presentation, which I'm doing here. I did at the New School a couple of weeks ago with Robert Polito in New York. I've shown it a couple of places, other places in the country. I've done this presentation, but I don't know how people are going to know that it's there. I have no idea. I did enter it in a worldwide competition for the best book of 2012, which is the Robert F. Kennedy Award for Journalism, and I have yet to hear about that. I have no idea what's going to happen with that. Yes?
Is it available as an audiobook?
No. No. Yes.
Did you mention whether the shelters is still in existence?
The social is still in existence, and it's still being run by the same organization, yes.
So I'm thinking like some photographers like Kristen Berry go back and revisit the site decades later.
No. The shelter doesn't want to have anything to do with it. They don't want to be identified.
Right.
They don't want anybody to know where it is.
But you wouldn't consider going back and just doing like a sequel?
No.
No.
Yeah.
Have you gotten any feedback from the participants?
I've gotten a lot of feedback from D'Angelo, who's the only one I get in touch with, and one other woman, the woman who took the picture of me in front of the shelter in 2000, which is a much younger me, so it was black hair, called me out of the blue because she saw it on the web and contacted me, and we had a talk, and we're back in touch with each other. She's living now, she has a young child, and she's living now in Washington, D.C. So I've gotten back in touch with her. Yeah. Yes?
How did you come about the title?
Crazy and Proud is an interesting question. It isn't pejorative, it isn't derogatory. It comes from the job that I had before the shelter. I was working for an agency in New York which also gave housing and help to mentally ill, homeless people, low-income people. And there was a whole group of consumers, all mentally ill, who had an email dialogue throughout the agency. And it was run by this guy named Howie the Hawk, who was one of the advocates who founded this whole movement. And they called the dialogue amongst themselves Crazy and Proud. And that's where I got the name from. That's how they referred to themselves.
Yeah, I thought about that. Maybe they called themselves.
Anybody else? Peter?
Have you tried to track down the other women?
I tried to track down the other women a few years ago. I went back to the shelter and I visited the administrators and I presented the photographs and the text to show it to them, to show them that I was doing it, and they were unable to get in touch with any of them. They tried, supposedly. Yeah.
Did any of the women know that you were going to write a book? And that you
They all knew. They all gave permission. And in the audio tapes that I did with them, each one I did an audio tape with. I asked them on the audio tape verbally, do you give permission for me to do this and for the book to be published and it's going to be distributed and published? And they said yes. And some of them even gave permission for me to use their identity and their name, but ultimately I decided to present them all anonymously. Yeah.
Did it change the way you take your pictures, the way that they took theirs, the way that they looked at it?
No, no. But it did give me some thought. It did give me a lot of food for thought. Yes, Barbara.
Concerning Amazon,
Amazon.
I look up things there, say on Asperger's or something.
It's on Amazon.
And the thing is, they'll suggest a bunch of other books.
Right.
And could you maybe get in those suggestions? Like say they looked up Tourette's, and your other book, your first book might show up, or could this maybe, because I found a lot of good stuff that I
Yeah.
wasn't intending to.
I don't
And
know.
some of it's ebooks.
Ebooks, yeah. I don't
Then
know.
let's-
I can't really devote any more time to it because I'm doing so many other things now. I'm kind of left this and I'm doing other things now. And I'm involved in other projects. I have 2 other books now that are half finished that I'm trying to move along, and it's incredibly difficult. They both involve working with writers other than myself, and so it's exceptionally difficult. It's very difficult. And I've kind of left this to do whatever happens with it because I devoted so many years to it and so much time to it that I feel like it's there. If anybody wants to see it, it's there.
Now that it's out there, and it just is out there, it's probably going to filter through the woodwork.
I hope
and
so.
spread around.
I hope so. I hope so. I did a radio show in New York on WFMU. I don't know how many of you listened to it. I did a radio show that's archived on their website. It's a show, it's a talk, one of the only talk shows on the station. It's primarily a music station on WFMU. And the show is a talk show by this guy, Benjamin Walker, and it's called Too Much Information. It's on Monday night, so that's on there. Yes.
Is this the only experience you've had with an in-bed experience?
With what?
Is this the only in-bed experience you've had as a journalist or writer?
The only,
Is this the only experience you've had in terms of going into an environment and working with people through photography?
you mean with them photographing?
I'm asking if you've ever worked with other groups of people, working like this sort of very realistic.
Yes, I have. I have occasionally. I have occasionally throughout my career. In other venues and other places, yes, I have.
Did you build the same kinds of relationships?
It wasn't full-time, and it wasn't as intense. I've done some volunteer work. I've also done some part-time work doing this with kids and disadvantaged kids and other groups, but I've never done it full-time, every day, 5 days a week, with mentally ill adults like this. This was the most intense experience. Yes, Christine?
In the book, you mentioned something there at the beginning of the book about traveling with Oliver Sacks.
You're talking about my first book, or this book?
No, I thought it.
Oh, it is in this
the
book,
information
yes.
about you.
When I was talking about traveling with Oliver Sacks.
Yeah. And so in terms of going off this last question about kind of being surrounded in the group and being in the group, certainly was that advantageous for you to be shooting with Oliver Sacks?
Well, with Oliver, I don't know if people know who Oliver Sacks is, but he's a very famous best-selling writer. And in fact, his 80th birthday is coming up this summer. And I'm speaking in New York in 2 weeks at a celebration of his turning 80, which is being done by an organization in New York called Live Arts. And that's going to be a 5-day symposium in New York City that's being done by some of the people at the New Yorker. And I'm presenting at that on April 21st, in fact, which is a Sunday. But yes, traveling with Oliver exposed me to a lot of other things. It had nothing to do with mental illness. It had nothing to do with this. But it exposed me to a lot of things that he was involved in. I'm not sure what your question is.
Yeah, just having, you were acting to photograph what he was interested in.
Yeah, I was in a sense, really, I was his photographer. Oliver hired me as his as his photographer, but I was also his Tourette pet. Yes.
Did you have a plan, or for working with the women, or did you just make it up by the seat of your pants? As you
I made it up by the seat of my pants, but I had an idea and a plan going into the job. This is what I would do. I needed a job, and that was my primary reason for getting the job, and it was just barely enough to live on in my rent-stabilized apartment in Manhattan. But I went into it thinking, as soon as I started the job, that this is what I would do. And very soon after starting the job, I started making notes and writing on the backs of napkins and scraps of paper in my apartment, thinking that this would be a book eventually. I just didn't think it would take 12 years.
You sound really busy, but because of this immersion experience, do you think it's something you'd like to do again? To write, to immerse yourself in another type of situation, to write another book?
Yes, I'm doing that in the 2 other book projects, but none of it involves this subject. They're all
Right.
different things.
Yeah,
None of
right.
it involves mental illness, because I've done that.
Right.
But they involve other things. There are 2 other projects that I'm halfway done with, what I think will be full-length books. And they involve other photography with other subjects. But I do it all the time as soon as I have a new subject or a new idea, I immerse myself in that, whatever it is. As much as time will allow with this job.
Was there any like really frustrating moments in this whole process, or
Excuse me?
was there any like really frustrating moments throughout this whole process you had to deal with?
There were many frustrating moments,
Was there any like one in particular, or?
Well, I mean, there were a lot of frustrations working at the job there. There were frustrations in trying to do the book. There were frustrations in just trying to get it out and read by people, by publishers who, either they didn't read it or they didn't respond or they didn't give a shit or whatever it was. But the whole thing is very difficult. It's almost an impossible thing to do now. Yeah.
If you could pick one thing that surprised you most about these women, what would it be?
What surprised me most about the women, if I were to say one thing, it would be their incredible fortitude and perseverance in living their life with dignity. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Thanks, Mom. Yes.
I missed it. I missed, no, what part of the city? What part of New York?
What's the shelter in?
Yes.
I can't.
Oh, you can't even say what borough?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
You said when you couldn't find a job at first, was it this specific type of photography, like lifestyle, that you were aiming to look for, or were you just trying to go to go to agencies and show a portfolio?
It had nothing to do with photography. It had nothing to do with photography. I was just looking for a job to pay the rent. I mean, I just had to have some job.
And
You
they
already
just
had
have,
the photography skill.
Yes, I had worked as a photographer for many years. Yes.
For what type of photography?
I was a freelance magazine photographer. I was a freelance photojournalist. Yeah. But I didn't have a job, and I was out of money, so I needed to get jobs. And I spent a year looking for a job, and this is the job that I got. There was no other job to get. Any other questions? It doesn't have to be about the book or photography. It could be about the economy or the war or politics, or really anything at all. Personal lives, anything.
well, I may be starting some arts-related groups with the mental health unit at a local hospital, and I was just wondering, any advice? I have no clue what I'm doing either.
Good luck. Anybody else? Thank you all very much.